If you've ever thought, I love assassins, intrigue, and a side of epic fantasy with my bromance, then today's book just might be for you. Today, we're diving into Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and back by popular demand is my partner in crime, my fellow bookworm and reluctant reader of Bromantasy. Welcome to my Bromantasy co-host, Trevor.
By popular demand, did you mean you and me?
Yeah, well, that's enough to make it popular to me. Trevor, we are picking up where we left off in this wildly popular series, the Throne of Glass series, with a look at the second book, which is of course Crown of Midnight. Trevor, do you have any initial thoughts on Crown of Midnight that you'd like to share before we dig in?
No, we better. I better save those thoughts for us to dig in. It was a good follow up to the first one, and I actually liked this book even better than the first one, which is surprising for maybe a couple reasons. But I don't know. We'll get into the specifics as to why. But yeah, so it was. I was pleasantly surprised.
Okay, well, let's remind the viewers of our three rules as we cover these books. First of all, it is our goal to avoid any unfair roasting. I don't even think we are quite witty enough for it anyways, but we are taking on very popular books, and we're going to give our honest feedback, but it's not our intention to just straight up roast them. Second of all, we can't ignore the tropes, but we also don't plan on spending our whole time talking about them, because if we did, we would just get bogged down in what is pretty common among, again, a very popular genre of romantasy, largely speaking. I think is full of tropes that we can't just let ourselves get too distracted by. And third, and I think this is probably the most popular of our 3 points, is that we have a strict rule of a 2-to-1 praises to criticism. So if we want to make a criticism, we have to make sure that we also give at least 2 things that we liked about the book before we dig into that criticism. Anything you would like to add to our 3 rules, Trevor?
No, I'm just ready to talk about this book.
All right. Well, let me say, we start out with our summary, and I have to, from the get-go, say spoiler alert. I believe last time we tried to avoid spoilers until the end, or I forget exactly which point in the video, but we really can't discuss this book without acknowledging some of the biggest spoilers, basically from the get-go, let alone if we even want to reference the previous book, we are going to be, diving into a fair amount of spoilers right away. So I think to avoid trying to, walk around it, or to avoid trying to pull any punches that I think could really undermine our efforts, I think we're just going to acknowledge the fact that we are full of spoilers this time around. Just as a reminder, this is the second book in the series, and so we are picking up where we left off in the previous book. As you recall, our main character is Celaena Sardothien, and in this book, we're going to solidify her role as the King's Champion, which, as a reminder, that is how the previous book ended, and we're going to see her navigating some deadly secrets, some treacherous politics, and of course, her own identity is a central theme in this book. The story, as I said, picks up with her reluctantly carrying out some of the assassinations for the tyrannical king of Ardalan. However, she is secretly going to be, as we find out, faking the deaths of her targets. And she is going to be driven by her own, I don't know, we'll say moral compass, but as we have established, we are not entirely sure exactly what that means. But above all, she certainly does distrust the king. Do you have any thoughts, Trevor, on this idea of her moral compass being the reason that she avoids killing these people?
I definitely have some thoughts on this, and this is one thing that I'd like to discuss in more depth. So I won't get into it so much in this section, but simply put, I don't have a strong sense of what drives her moral code at this point through the 2 books. And so I think even upon finishing this book, I still don't really know what's driving her and how she's making these decisions.
Okay. Well, we will certainly talk more about that. Going back to the summary, meanwhile, Celaena's relationship with Crown Prince Dorian has become quite strained as she grows closer to the captain of the guards, Chaol, who is her trainer and I don't know, maybe something more. Okay, I admitted there's going to be spoilers, and yes, we will see that something more happens. But looking back at the prince, who of course has his very carefree attitude, Dorian actually starts to struggle with the expectations of the heir apparent, as well as his growing magical powers, because magic has been outlawed, and he really has nobody that he can confide in, and few people to help him understand his new abilities, especially since he is giving off this carefree lifestyle. And so he just doesn't really have very close friends, and these powers further alienate him from his father. Do you have anything you want to add about Dorian's powers or the ever so slightly additional revelations on the magic system, Trevor?
Ladies, if you thought Prince Dorian was magic in bed, wait until you see this. We'll see what happens with his powers. It does seem like it's a way to add a little bit more depth to his character, some complexity as he kind of struggles with being in this kind of precarious situation based on, his father's stance on magic and, being the prince and, trying to figure that out and not really having anywhere to turn. And so it does kind of put Dorian in a new position and a place where we can kind of allow him to see that character development for him. So I thought it was an interesting situation to see him in and struggle with throughout this book.
Yeah, we'll touch more upon that later, but this is, of course, one of the big themes is his development. Looking back at our main character, Celaena, we are actually going to have a bit of a twist in the story when the king orders her to eliminate someone named Archer Finn. This is a little different from some of her previous assassinations. For starters, he is there in the capital city. She is not traveling far, which it seems as though for all of her previous assassinations, she has to go far off to a distant land, which is one of the many things that actually made it easy for her to fake the deaths. And so she approaches this man who has, Archer Finn, who is suspected of plotting against the crown, and you find out that he is also someone from Celaena's past. Trevor, what are your thoughts on one of the few new characters of Archer Finn?
He was an interesting character. I do think this is a little bit of a nitpick. I didn't think it was worth saving for the end when we were discussing likes and dislikes, because it was a minor thing, but it was weird. It kind of hit me an interesting way, where he was a guy that has been trafficked for sex for the better part of his life, and he's in kind of this weird situation. And then as soon as he sees a familiar face, his first thing is to, hey, let me try to, get her to go back home with me. It felt a little weird and maybe a little too, I don't know, it seemed off for somebody, even a guy, to think that way. But again, maybe I'm just overthinking it, looking more seriously at this than it deserved. But I just thought that was kind of an interesting reaction from this character. But outside of that, yeah, I thought he was an interesting character and a fun.
I thought the name Archer Finn was like a little too on the nose. Like, it felt like you were trying to describe like a Robin Hood, or even like a James Bond-esque individual that's supposed to be like super suave. I was like, I think you could try a little harder with the name here.
That's true. I do keep wanting to call him Finn Rider from Tangled. So that is kind of the vibe that I get from him.
Anyways, looking at Archer Finn, our main character Celaena, she initially is going to hesitate in killing him. Surprise, surprise. That's what she's been doing this whole time. And her investigation actually uncovers his involvement in a rebel group that is aiming to overthrow the king. And so Celaena sees this as an opportunity to discover more information about these forces and let him live as long as he can keep feeding her information. And as Celaena grows closer to Chaol, surprise, surprise, the relationship also deepens, and eventually it develops into romance. And I don't feel the need to go into too much detail. I actually didn't feel like there was, I mean, the book certainly does give this somewhat dramatic moment of them finally going from friends to something more than that, but I wouldn't say that it was actually all that interesting of a scene. It wasn't like on the back of some exciting fight scene or anything like that, but you do eventually have this moment where they deepen into romance. But of course, this poorly hidden entanglement is short-lived when Chaol is actually kidnapped by some mysterious group. And while Celaena is trying to save Chaol, her friend Naemia, she's the princess of this far-off land, Elway, and she is actually going to be brutally murdered while Celaena is trying to save Chaol. And Celaena is devastated, and she actually suspects that Chaol knew of the threat against Neemia and that he failed to warn her. And this betrayal fractures the relationship, and it pushes Celaena into a dark and vengeful state. Any additional details about this very dramatic shift in the book, Trevor?
I have to admit, I was surprised that Maas did this, and in the way that she did it, and the timing that she did it, it was very abrupt. Even though you kind of heard rumblings of it, you knew there was some danger or whatever. I didn't take it too seriously, and when it finally happened, it did. It felt very abrupt, which I think added to the emotion of that. But yeah, I was surprised by it, and give her props for going through with it.
Yeah. Well, we can talk more about that when we get to things we liked and disliked, because I was also surprised by that. I found that a pretty significant turn of events. This was her only female friend, which usually plays a sizable role in a series like this, and to take her away like that. Also, I was under the impression that she was going to lead us to something more significant, whether get more involved with some kind of group, a rebellion or something like that. And so to have her taken away and killed in such a brutal manner was surprising. But I actually also found what came next to be quite surprising, as she goes on basically her murder spree, trying to take down anyone that had any involvement whatsoever. Of course, on top of that, we have lots of other things that are also going on. We've already mentioned Dorian. Celaena is going to dive deeper into the mysteries of the king's power and the source of the magic that he has banished. That's becoming more evident. In the first book, we just mentioned the fact that, this was an old thing from the past and that you no longer have magic. But in this, we're starting to see much more of why it's been banished and how it actually could be benefiting the king. She is going to discover weird marks and ancient magical symbols, and she's going to learn about the existence of the word keys, which are artifacts that grant immense power and could have been used by the king to destroy magic. And her investigation leads her to hidden truths, including the revelation of her true identity as a part, here's the big spoiler, as part Fae and alien Asherver Galanthinius, the rightful queen of Terrasin. Trevor, what do you make of this revelation?
I mean, we all knew it was coming, right?
I wasn't 100% sure that would be the revelation. Like you'd said, even in the last video, there was going to be some connection to some kind of higher position, whether it was being nobility from one of the kingdoms that the king had taken over or something along those lines. I thought her interaction with magic was a little, she had a bit of curiosity in the first book, but not enough to lead me to believe that that would necessarily be her identity. And of course, right here, it all gets laid out, and at least it is really the big turn that comes at the end of the book. And we actually are going to end the book with Chaol discovering Celaena's identity as well, but also keeping it a secret from Dorian and the king, obviously. And Celaena decides to leave for Winland under the guise of completing a mission for the king, but with a lot of questions about what she will actually do once she gets there. Any other thoughts, Trevor, on the last little scene in the book in which we're seeing her off to this far-off kingdom and essentially putting her in a better position to be reconnected with her roots?
I like the stories expanding beyond the castle. It's going out into the world, so there's going to be I think, much bigger world to introduce and more characters, and so I think it's really going to allow the story to progress and advance. At least that's what I'm hoping and looking forward to.
Okay. Any other characters you wanted to mention that I forgot to mention? I didn't. I think Finn was really the only new character that I mentioned.
Yeah, there was like Baba Yellowlegs, the creepy old lady who was a witch of some sort. There's also cousin Roland, who's Prince Dorian's cousin, who seems sus, and like he'll play a bigger role down the road. He seems like another character is being used as a puppet. And then there's Caltaine, who was in the prison, the character from the first book, who was kind of a rival of Celaena's, and she was not in this book as much, but they're definitely pointing to her again, setting her up to have a more significant role in subsequent books.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into our previous sections and see what kinds of things we can pull out of this about what we liked most about this book, what we found most interesting. First of all, any big updates on our previous predictions that have already been proven or been thwarted in this book? Do you have any thoughts on those? Our biggest update was, of course, that you said our biggest prediction was that she was some kind of nobility, right? That was the first thing you mentioned, as I recall from the first video. And well, I guess we don't have to go too many books for that.
I will say I was a little surprised at how quickly it was revealed within this series. Although I guess if it's not going to be so shocking, if you think people are going to figure it out anyway, I guess may as well make it known. And then also because like you were saying, the longer you keep it hidden, the harder I think it would be as an author to keep her motives uh, consistent with that past without giving it away, if that makes sense. Because her thoughts, like we're in her head, so we're not just seeing her actions, we're actually seeing her thoughts, and they have to align with what she knows. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like she can't have all these thoughts and all these experiences and ignore that huge part of her character and the relevancy to everything that's going on and never think about that and make those connections in her brain. And so I think it was good that they did that she brought that up in this book already. And then I think in the other tropes, I mean, there was the love triangle, so that continued to play a role.
Yeah.
Like Chaol.
Let's update that one. So, as I recall in the last video, you specifically said that, well, it's obviously going to be Chaol, right? We see Dorian is kind of annoying, and in the first book, he was written in a way to possibly have some room to grow that might make this a more interesting love triangle, but you were convinced that Chaol would be the person that she'd finally end up with. And obviously, we were long from that being decided, but where does that stand by the end of this book? I mean, how would you characterize not just how it's obviously stated, but also what you expect to happen going forward?
Are you asking because she tried to murder Chaol? Is that you think that might change my mind? No,
well, okay, so
I do think that puts a damper on things. However, I kind of still feel like he's the end game, but it definitely does have me questioning more in the sense that you are starting to see more character growth with Dorian, and they're on better. She and him are on better terms. I still think Chaol is down the road that there will be a path that they get back together. I was actually thinking for a while that Dorian and Nehemia might have something because there was such dislike, and that there's a chance for him to have that character growth. And I thought that would have been an interesting way. Obviously, that's not happening now. But
yeah, well, so I don't want to get too much into this prediction because it goes into my big likes and dislikes. But the stated, what is obvious by the end of this book, as you've said, is she has tried to kill Chaol, and she hates Chaol, and she has her reasons for hating Chaol. And interestingly, in this book, I do think we've gone a long ways in making Dorian more likable, although hasn't really been a lot of additional interaction between them. Matter of fact, she is still keeping him at a significant distance throughout this book. Even by the end, it's not like they've majorly repaired their rift, although they've had a much more interaction by the end than they did in the beginning. Again, setting up this idea of this being a love triangle. But I mean, I think that, like you said, I think that the end game is still Chaol. I think, and I'll say more about this in the last section, but I think that it is written with some pretty obvious outs that are going to make it so that this rift between them is not permanent and will be resolved. And I still think that Chaol is the end game, like you said. So that would be my biggest update. So our first big update, she has revealed that she is, of course, some kind of nobility. We will see how that plays out. I don't know if you have any more predictions that you want to go with that you have to say.
No, I really don't have more predictions at this time. So
Yeah.
that I guess that's something that she's done well. Is I'm not sure where this story is going, other than I think there eventually it'll lead up at the end to some big battle where she's leading the charge to thwart whoever, and whether it continues to be the king or some dark power from a different world or something coming in, that she'll be there to protect them, unite the people, whatever. Outside of that, I don't really know where this story is going to go and what's what they're going to face. Going back to the love triangle real quick, I just want to say, because you said that there are
Well,
some
hold on, before we go to
Oh,
the love triangle, let me give a similar response
okay.
to this because this whole like world saving. I mean, I'm not sure what my prediction is. I do find it interesting that we end this book specifically centering her off to the place where she will probably have the most support, have the biggest opportunity to get more support. What I'm having a hard time predicting is what that looks like, because I don't fully understand how much control Dorian's father has. The first book suggests that he controls basically everything, and that there just happens to be these outlier kingdoms that are still putting up maybe a little resistance to giving him total control. But that would still suggest that she's not about to like take a throne in some far off territory and immediately have the army behind her back, but rather she is going to have to do this from a resistance perspective and have like an underground force that she starts working with, which would match her MO as an assassin much more. So that is the hardest element of predicting, that I am not sure where I stand yet, and I am very intrigued in the third book to see what approach we're taking. Since she's being sent off to this far off land, is it going to be well, I'm now in a kingdom that I have more support and it'll be a pretty straightforward rebellion, or is it even there, it's still going to have to be this underground approach? And I don't know yet. I'm inclined to say that I still think, at least to make sense in my mind, it would have to be the latter, based off of just how much control the king does seem to have, first of all, and second of all, again, playing back into her character as an assassin. That would be my current prediction, looking at this, world-saving element. But those are my thoughts on that. As for the love triangle, I will let you finish your thought on your predictions with that.
Okay, so again, I still think Chaol is the end game. Like you said, there's some relatively easy outs for it, and I think this. So within the conversation of tropes, this does tend to be a trope, I guess, in literature, when there has to be some sort of falling out between the protagonist and the love interest, but yet it can't be so bad that they can't find their way back together and not have the reader completely, reject that. They have to still want them back together. And so the way that's often done is kind of like the Michael Scott, I care too much, and
What's your biggest weakness? Yeah.
where they do something where it's like, I'm just really standoffish because I'm mad at the world because there's orphans or something. And so it's like, oh, that's why he's so mean, is because he loves orphans. Like, so, like, something like that. And so, like, kind of like this, it's like he was doing the sensible thing, trying to protect her by not telling her, while simultaneously doing everything he could to try to protect Nehemia. He wasn't forthright. But to me, and I've got more comments on this whole segment later, but just to me, that feels like he had her best interest at heart and was trying to take care of her.
I have to cut in here and say, I feel like our biggest constraint is we're trying to save all of our complaints until the end, and I think it becomes obvious. Like, we're like, oh, we'll save that for later. We'll save that for later. I do want to add this short little, just blurb right here, that I liked this book more. There were some things I still didn't like, but I really did appreciate that we are seeing it get better. And let me at least have that as a little insertion and a little starting point as it becomes more and more obvious that we do have things that we want to say, and we're saving them for the last section.
Well, I'm done with predictions and I think tropes. So if you want to, let's move into that and say what it is we want to say.
Okay. Fine. I mean, we covered the did we cover all the major predictions? The love triangle, her secret identity. There was one more I wanted to touch upon, but I'm blanking on it at the moment. We'll find out as it comes out. So let's do our 2-to-1. Did you want to start, or did you want me to start?
I've kind of already started.
Well,
Actually,
okay. Make sure you give your 2 likes, and then I'll let
okay.
you.
Well, I guess to my likes, and I would say that, and again, these are things I've kind of already said, is that I think that you're starting to see a little bit more character growth, a little bit more nuance in the plot to allow for more character development and see different sides of characters. So that is something that she's done. We talked about that with. Well, really all the characters, with Dorian trying to struggle. Okay, I've got magic now, which, so he doesn't really have anywhere to turn with it. And then Chaol, and then the way the plot develops and they're falling out, and how can he continue to protect her? Now he's, making deals with his dad so that so it's all these things that people are now kind of split in their motives and kind of isolated. And so that's creating a little bit more intrigue, and I think making it a little bit more interesting, and just instead of just kind of, hey, we're all happy, hey, we're all the good guys, we all do good things or whatever. Speaking of which, along that vein, is Celaena is conflicted throughout the book. She has a lot of, she's in a weird situation, being basically beholden to this man who she hates and stands for everything she hates, and we learn more about that in this book, why she hates him so much, and yet she's like trying to do the right thing, and she's found herself in an interesting situation with the king's son, and with the leader of his guard, and all this. And so I do like seeing that struggle with the main character, where the choices in front of you aren't always clear and obvious. Having said all that, I'm still, and we talked about this at the top of the video, is I'm still unclear about what does motivate her. And truthfully, maybe she doesn't know, which I guess is kind of an interesting thing to explore. But I want to talk specifically about the killing, right? So this is something where I could not track her throughout this book at all. And I just kind of want to, and I think I've left some out, but I made notes. So she starts off, and this is going back to the book 1, where she says that, where she has a chance, she finds like kind of the secret passages, and she sees, oh, there would be a path for her to escape. And then she decides, no, I won't right now, because it's not the right thing, which I think was so weird. It had nothing to do with, the other mission and everything yet, because that hadn't come out yet. When she first had the chance, she's like, I got to see this thing through, and I'm going to earn my freedom the right way. I still think that's bizarre. But now coming into this book,
By killing people.
yeah, I would do the right thing by killing all these people for the king, who I actually hate. And then she goes out there, and then she doesn't actually kill for him. She's actually,
But with like no good explanation. It's not like, oh, I'm not killing them because now they're in my debt, or I'm setting up this web to undermine them. No, it's like, well, I didn't feel like killing them, even though, I was a world-renowned assassin before this.
so I didn't quite get that, because I was like, oh, she's not doing it. Because like, had she stayed and been like, you know what, I have to stay because that is what I was told to do by the queen. When she came, she said, you have to stay. You need to be the king's champion. So that's what I'm doing for whatever reason. But the way I'm going to be the champion is I'm going to thwart him. I am going to, do all these things to undermine him while staying close to him. She doesn't say any of that. She's like, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to kill for him. Then she doesn't kill for him. And then, but what she does do,
but with no, like, my biggest hang up on the fact that she's not killing for him is that she doesn't have a plan, and it completely undermines her characterization of being an assassin. I'm like, I still don't, I can't believe this, like, that I'm still caught up on the premise of her being an assassin, which I'll let you finish, because I have thoughts on that whole characterization still. I know that was my biggest beef in the first book, but it's still a problem to me.
Well, so let's keep going through this. So as you mentioned, there's no real plan, because even Nehemia comes to her. She's like trying to get her on their side, like, come on, like, join us. And Nehemia actually knows who Celaena is, right? And so she's trying to get her in and get her to pick a side, and she still won't. And she's like, no, because she's afraid of what the retaliation would be. But while she's kind of actively doing that, even though she says she's not, and then she has no problem killing the guy when she's spying in his office. Granted, it was in self-defense; he was attacking her, but she broke into his office, and he was even somebody who she suspected as being an enemy of the king, who is her enemy. And then with Baba Yellowlegs, I understood that she was creepy, probably didn't want to go back and visit her. You probably need to get out of there. Don't know what could happen. She murdered her in cold blood. Like, she decided she knows too much. I can't about the prince. I can't let her go on because that would endanger my friend. So now that is like straight up cold blood murder. So that is okay, but not, the assassinations. And then she continues to threaten to kill Archer, but she never does, going against her better judgment. She's like, this is dangerous. This is going out too long. He's letting too many people out. This is going to give us both away. And she does not kill him, even though she always threatens him. And I think she thinks she means it, at least. Tries to kill her boyfriend over him trying to protect her. And then...
Can I digress on that one? Let me give my 2 likes, because, and this will probably be essentially my biggest complaint of the whole book. But let me say a few things. First of all, I did appreciate that there was actually more fighting, because there's basically no fighting in the first book. So I appreciate it. And we actually also know what weapons she is good at. Spoiler, it's all of them. There doesn't seem to be a weapon she can't use well. I think they suggest swords are maybe her most common weapon, but I'm not entirely sure. And I really enjoyed that there was more suspense, and it was much better written. At the very least, each chapter, at least major chapters, tended to have a cliffhanger in a quality way that I was like, good. The quality of writing has clearly improved in that respect. So those are some things I liked. I hated the whole premise of her coming to hate Chaol. I felt like it was incredibly contrived. I was like, well, I don't understand. You're mad at him that he didn't tell you that there was possibly a threat on her life, even though he could not tell you. I mean, we don't even know how much he knew, first of all. Second of all, we have no idea if what he knew actually was significant. Like, does he not frequently hear about the threat on people's lives? My first thought was, the president of the United States, he has, dozens of death threats every day. And so that was kind of my thoughts. Like, we don't know if this was just like chatter. We have, it felt so contrived. It felt like the most contrived part of the whole book, and it was simply to drive what we know to be a long-term love triangle, even though from the get-go, from the first book, it appeared as though those were going to be the two that end up together. But now we have to create what I think to be wholly inauthentic elements to try and make this, an actual love triangle. I did think that the Dorian part was done better. I thought that, yes, we are seeing growth. We are seeing him deal with something that he can't relate to anyone. I actually thought that he was much better written. I did not like him in the first book, and I thought to myself, I know you're going to try to make him more likable, but I'm probably going to drag my feet the whole time. I actually thought by the end of this book, I was like, I find Dorian a sympathetic character. I don't know if he is quite as morally directed as he should be, but then again, as we've been discussing, that seems to be an ongoing problem with this book. And it's similar with Chaol, though. I don't fully understand people's allegiances. I don't fully understand, I don't understand the much of the premise of what is driving people, and I think that is one of the fundamental flaws of this book. And I hope it doesn't spread to the whole series, but up to this point, I am just baffled by people's motivations in a way that really undermines the book. And like we've been saying, I think Celaena's is the most egregious, but I think it's pretty obvious for all of them. Like, I don't fully get their motivation. Like, what is causing them to act the way that they're acting? My biggest issue is that I just feel like we know that you want there to be a love triangle, and I just felt like the mechanism, the MacGuffin for doing so, is not high quality. It felt contrived. I was like, ugh. But giving another thing I loved her rampage afterwards, though. I was like, thank you. Like, you're finally actually playing to her assumed qualities and her assumed role as an assassin in a way that you have not done at any other point in these books. And on top of that, they do give more background to her time spent in the mines. And I felt like, although it wasn't amazing, I did feel like it was generally much better done. I was like, good, you're acknowledging that you have given this person a backstory that carries a lot of weight with it, and you're actually having it play out to a certain degree in this book. And I did enjoy those two elements that, are playing a little more into Celaena's character development. That being said, my biggest issue is she did not need to be an assassin. It doesn't make sense. Just say that she was a thief. Say that she had some other nefarious underworld life. But specifically an assassin does not make sense so far. She is not reflecting it in almost any way. Her rampage is basically the only time it's reflected it. But even then, it undermines the fact that an assassin is someone who is hired to kill people and has no moral compass. Even her rampage, which shows off her incredible skill, it is not done because she's been hired to do it. It's done because she's incredibly angry. And so it is showing a certain incongruity. I'm not entirely sure Sarah J. Maas knew what an assassin was when she started writing this book. That is what I'm starting to feel like as I'm reading these.
Oh, I kind of agree with that. I think she's scarier when she's, or has the potential to be scarier when she's calm and cool, collected, and she knows what she's doing and she's doing it methodically. Like, I think that is what I think of as the assassin versus the killing rampage. Less so. I did like, the fight scene where she's taking on all of Archer's men and trying to save Chaol, and that shows. Also, well, no, I mean, maybe that's a dislike, so I won't go there because it's a nitpick. But I want to focus on some of the other things.
Should we name our 8 likes? They're out there, and so we did our 2-1.
No, I mean, like I said, I don't know. I do think this is a better book. I still think, like, between the two books, like if this were a Netflix series, these first 2 books would have been like 3 episodes or something. Like, not a whole lot happens in these. I mean, maybe you get a little more out of it. Whereas we're talking about Harry Potter and everybody wants, okay, this new HBO series, we want at least 1 season for every book so they can go in and like give it all the depth and everything it needs. And these books, I don't feel like need that. I feel like you could get what you needed out of these in a few episodes for maybe 5, and so there's not a lot there. And I don't know if that's necessarily an insult or a dislike. That's just how I see these books. But I do like, again, she's willing to make some choices that I think surprised me. We talked about Nehemia and killing her. Not only did she kill her, I kind of like it. Like, I hate it when, sometimes people die, but they always have their moment. Nehemia didn't have her moment. It felt cut off short, and that there's still just a little bit more. I still thought we'd see her a little bit more, even if she were to die at the end of the book, it would be done differently. And that kind of hurts a little bit as a reader. You're like, no, that's not complete. Now, there was, I guess, kind of a trope that we didn't talk about, a kind of cop out where you still get to see her again, but she's not back alive. So yeah, I did like.
Maybe the magic system will allow that. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, but maybe.
Yeah, and that's the next another thing that I think I like her kind of slow burn, in a sense, systematic approach of rolling out the magic system. I can't say I still have like a strong grasp of what it is.
I think that's by design, which I think is fine.
Yeah, I agree, and that's where I'm going with it. I don't have a strong grasp of what it is, and I do think that that's okay, and it fits with the story. I feel like we know what we need to know thus far, and obviously more is going to come. And so again, for where this book ended, and again. So what I really like now, to kind of a through line with all of that, is I think this book was a natural extension of the first one. I think that there was character growth. I think you talked about Dorian. You said, you still don't understand his motivations, which is true. He does seem a little inconsistent, but I feel like
to his credit, I think it at least makes sense that he doesn't have pure motivations, because he's a Casanova that doesn't know what he wants. But I do think he does have this, at least a bit of morality, although it's not like fully formed. But because of the place where he's growing up, I think, at least the way he is written, it is giving room, not just for him to grow, but for him to make sense and be like, I do what I want, but also I do feel bad about things that I'm seeing around me in a way that doesn't make sense with Celaena. in a way that the growth does actually seem natural and have an authentic progression to it. That's my opinion, which I'm not gonna lie, that surprised me, because in the first book I was like, I do not like Dorian. I know she's gonna make him grow and I'm supposed to like him, but by the end of this I was like, actually I like him a little more, which annoys me knowing that is supposed to make this love triangle element of it all the more realistic. I'm like, oh gosh. Because, well, I guess one, because I knew it was going to happen, but I really hated the approach to giving the rift between Chaol and Celaena. I was like, oh, that was such a dumb. That was so dumb. Anyway.
Yeah, but to your point, that was where I was going. Is I do think it felt natural, though. It didn't feel like forced or his character was changed. It felt like his character was just following a progression, and so I do like that. And I think that this story went to a place, like, again, I don't think tons happened, but it helped kind of set up paths of these characters, and it ended in a place where, okay, this is now setting us up. Like the first one, the book was like introducing the story. This one, I think, was now kind of giving us a little bit more. Now I feel like it's really opening up to allow a lot more to happen. This is setting up, I think, more in-depth dynamics, because and this is, I guess, where I'll go with my dislike here, is I don't feel like the politics in this world is very sophisticated. So I've read other books meant for children. So we're talking about C.S. Lewis, A Horse and His Boy, and the Boy. My daughter loves a series called Tuesdays at the Castle. I think that the politics done in those, like, there's political intrigue in these books, and these are meant for children, is almost done better, because this was almost too much. I don't know. Everything was just so black and white, and there was really no explanation for it. And this goes back to, I think, our overarching theme that I think we could say that of things that we dislike is understanding the motivations from these books. And so this is talking about the king now from his perspective. I don't really understand, because you were talking about this earlier, in terms of what kind of power he has, which I don't understand, because he, at the end of the first book, because it leads you to believe he's got power over everything. He's got it. Like, you can't challenge him at all. But then they have Nehemia. There's a plot for Nehemia, and they get kind of called out. He's like, oh, they're on to us. Let's not do anything with Nehemia now. So it's like, what are you worried about? You're worried about this uprising, and then, or not? Like, does he? I don't know. I was trying to figure out where his power, how much power he had, what he was trying to be influenced by. And then same in this book. They kill Nehemia, and then he's like, no, we're not going to write to her parents and apologize and do all this stuff. But then it's like, wait, so now all the, like, in the first book, you're like, no, we don't want them onto us, because we're going to use her as political bait or whatever, over these rebels. And now in this one, she's brutally murdered in this castle. He has nothing to do with it. And he's like, no, we're not going to apologize. We're not going to say anything. But then when the guy on his council gets outed by Celaena, she comes and, like, brings the head, which is another time, we talked about another murder that she does. He comes and he throws the guy in jail, because he's like, he's got to cover his butt and he's got to separate himself from this guy. But why? So, like, are there political ramifications from Nehemia being murdered, or are there not? Like, I just, again, I could not understand the king's motivations here, like, and like why he's always have to act in these clandestine modes. Is like, he's got these meetings, and it's like, are you all powerful or not? Because, like, you need to be a little more, and then, like, why does it matter if people know he has an assassin if he's, like, all powerful? And who are these people? Like, there are so many people that he's needing assassinated. I just don't fully.
It doesn't seem like a classic courtly, like, I have to balance the, all these different aristocrats and all these different landlords, and I have to, like, keep everyone happy type of courtly intrigue. It just seems, and there's actually very few people that we even talk about when it comes to the court life, and it's just like, well, that could definitely use more fleshing out. And I think you're black and white. I think that comment is very true, especially with the king. He is written cartoonishly bad in a way that, like, doesn't even give any real, like, explanation as to his background or what his motivation could possibly be. He's just an evil king. I mean, written, like, seriously from, like, well, I shouldn't be too insulting, but from a child's perception of what a king is.
Well, and she tries to, like, acknowledge that in this book, which I give her credit for. She says this, and I wrote this down. This is a quote. There was never absolute good or absolute evil, although the king was definitely an exception. So at least she acknowledges that, like, that is how she wrote this character. There's no exception. He is just
That was in the
bad.
book. That's a good quote. I actually like that. That's decent
Maybe
writing
there
for
will
her.
be more, down the line. Maybe we'll see more. Oh, this is what was driving the king, and he felt he had to do this, and it was for this greater good. Even if it was warped and twisted or whatever, that kind of approach. But no, she just said it, and to me, it felt like in these books, at least in the first book, it was like, if you are good looking, you are a good guy. If you are ugly, you are a bad guy. And now, but to that, she established that as kind of that's what this was, and then that made the Archer, reveal all that much more interesting. Was that like, oh, you really felt like she had a past with him? She kind of knew this guy. He was against the king, and therefore we should have associated that as good. And so now she has, by the end of this book, introduced more nuance to the storyline, to the different sides, the different factions, and I think that there's real room to play with that, and I expect her to going forward. But it was there and it was under our nose. We just didn't know it throughout most of this book, and based off of all I had was like the first book leading into this,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think that there was a lot of complexity there. I will say that she did get there, and that was kind of the reveal. It's kind of weird that your reveal of the book is, aha, there was more depth to my story than you thought.
So I have a question. I
Yeah.
was a little confused at the end. She already knew she was part Fae, right? Like I didn't understand the reveal. That she was fully aware of that, wasn't she?
Yeah, and that was to my point. It's like it's hard to write that when we're inside her head for her never to have thought, well, I'm
Right.
part Fae. I can't like that never crosses her mind. And so for her to have that like suppressed or not be thinking of that and that not playing into all these other thoughts and experiences she's having, I'd have to go back and look like, do these thoughts line up with that? Or is she like
Right.
basically lying to us so that we can't know that, what the truth is? You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, well, and I think that'll become more evident in the subsequent books because she does have this intrigue with the glyphs that she sees and all the different things. But again, with her inner monologue, it never seems to suggest, well, I'm interested in this because I'm part Fae. Instead, it's just like, ooh, what is this strange world? What could it possibly mean? And so I am curious in the subsequent books, will that actually make more sense? Will they write it in a way of saying like, yes, I knew I was part Fae, but I didn't actually know a darn thing about it?
mhm.
Or is it going to be written in a way that kind of undermines these first few books and the fact that you were trying to keep that hidden makes the element of the inner monologue just kind of inauthentic by the time we actually dig deeper into what she did and didn't know.
Unauthentic. That I think that's a good way of describing it, and we will see. I'm guessing because it's a good narrative device to bring us into it. Is that she might not know a lot. She was pretty young when she was
Mm-hmm.
separated from her parents. And that I'm guessing there will be a lot for her to
Well,
learn, and we
this
get to
this
learn.
goes back to one of my biggest issues with the book is just mathematically she does not make sense. Her what is she supposed to be 17 and yet
I
she
think she's
spent a
18
year
now.
in the mine and supposedly spent years as an assassin on top of spending years training to be an assassin on top of whatever her childhood was that would have made her fall in love with books and have some familiarity with the court life and just all the intrigues of the empire. I that is I know why you would want to write this character to be 17, but you also just have to acknowledge that you had to make choices there that I don't feel like the author wanted to make. So she just mathematically didn't let it make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something. Then getting into one, this is nitpick. I guess this is a one for one, but I'll put it. I do. Well, actually, I want to open up this question because my wife and I were discussing. We're on a trip now, and we're driving, and we're having some discussion about the book because she loves the series. Although, admittedly, she says the first three books are not the best. You kind of get
I
through
heard
those.
this one by reputation is the worst one,
Oh,
which
and I like this one better than the first one.
so that was my thought. I certainly liked it more than the first. I did still have some issues, especially some of my issues from the first book were still evident, but I also thought there was noted improvement in some really important ways. And so I did appreciate it more so in that way. And I do have to say, I've listened to the audiobook and it's terrible. The narrator is so bad. It was painful. I was like, ooh, yeah, this makes me not like this book.
But I think the lovers of the book love the narrator because they've listened to her
No.
through so much, and so
I hate every male voice that she does. It's just like it sounds like a teenager making fun of a male. It does not sound like she's actually trying to do a good voice at all. And it was like, especially the king. I was like, oh my gosh, this can't be real. Like this is honestly a kid's cartoon would do an evil king's voice this way. Like that is the kind of voice you're doing right now.
well, so the discussion we had is we got to the point where she was arguing that she does not think that this series or even these early books would be classified as romantasy. So I'm really curious from anyone watching this video, please let us know in the comments if you think this book or series, or at least to this point in the series, is you would consider it a romantasy. Because for me, I certainly do. I think that we talked about in the first book, there are three major storylines, and there's only one that's a through line really through the whole thing. With the strongest storyline was that love triangle and that relationship throughout the whole book that was talked about from the very first chapter to the very end. And I just, to me, so I guess it's like, well, how do you define it? Because just having romantasy in a book does not make something a romance. You can have
Yeah.
romance in a story without it being classified as a romance novel or whatever film. So I'm guessing where do you come out down on that? Having gone through these, do you still feel like, yeah, this is romantasy? Because to me, I think
Well,
there.
so I think the obvious thing you have to point out, and whether people would admit it or not, is neither of these first two books have particularly spicy scenes. This one has some, a little bit with Chaol, although not like super graphic. And I think that's a key part of romantasy. I think that if that's not in there, it is hard for people to characterize it as romantasy. And so I think the lack of those certainly would definitely affect characterizing this, or at least lumping it in with other popular romantasies. And then I think the other big thing is, and I think that's interesting that you would latch on to the first few books as an example of it. And I do think that it is honestly lower stakes at this point. Okay, so she had a thing with Chaol. It wasn't significant except for, I guess, for the plot of the book, but it wasn't significant in terms of like larger consequences at all. Like it didn't have it wasn't affecting her ability to become a queen. It wasn't affecting, like it wasn't part of courtly intrigue in any real way. And so I guess that could undermine at least the popular tropes that would be common in romantasy, is the fact that it doesn't seem all that important at this moment. And so I guess if the consequences become more obvious and become more apparent to the plot line, then maybe then you could consider it more romantasy. But I think really the lack of spice scenes are probably the biggest reason why. And
Well,
I
because
think the fact that you have them later, to my understanding, is why someone might say, oh, well, these aren't really romantasy, because it does become a defining feature eventually. So to not have them now might be why you would be quick to say, well, I don't know if I consider this as exactly the same genre. That's my thought. I don't know.
I mean, that might be an argument, and maybe that plays to how she views it. But there's enough like rom-com books out there that are just easy breezy love story books.
I,
Sometimes there's spice scenes, but sometimes there's fade to black. And this book had a fade to black, which I think was great because it didn't need more than that. But
right.
the gist of it.
So can I say I finished a book. I'll do its own video, but I'll say a little bit here that I'm going to say then, although I might tone it down then. But I read a book. It was on New York Times top 10 books for last year, and it was called Good Material. And I was doing the audiobook, and I didn't pay attention to who wrote it or anything. And the whole premise of the book is that it's this guy that just broke up with a girl, and it's him dealing with that breakup, and also just kind of reflecting on his own life, and then how he's a stand-up comedian, and then, so how he's going to work that into his stand-up routine. That's the basic premise. And for the first little bit, I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like I can see how he's going to use this as good material, and I can see how eventually you're going to be funnier. But it never got funnier. And then out of the blue, there was an unexpected spicy scene, and that was the first time I was like, this book is odd. And that is the first time I looked and said, oh, this is by a girl. This is much more romance than I realized. I thought that this was going to be a focus on the comedy. There isn't any real comedy. And yes, everything he does supposedly end up in his new special that he makes by the end of the book, but you don't actually like laugh at any of the parts. Like he doesn't write it in, or she doesn't write it in a particularly funny way, and so the narrator doesn't present it in a particularly funny way. And so as I was, contemplating on that, I had this just like visceral reaction to the fact that I all of a sudden saw the book differently when this spicy scene showed up out of nowhere, and it was the first time I realized, oh, this is actually written by a woman, and I was not prepared for this book in the way I should have been, and it kind of made me dislike the rest of the book. I was like, it was okay at first, but then his like talking about his broken relationship just like kept dragging and dragging. It wasn't getting funny as I was expecting it to, and then suddenly this one scene made me totally rethink the whole book, and I feel weird about that. Like part of me is like, well, that one scene shouldn't dramatically change how I think about the book, but it does, because it also was a total paradigm shift for me, and like, oh, this book isn't what I thought it was. Too bad it took me more than halfway through the book to realize that. And I don't know if that really answers your question in any way, but it is. I'm trying to address like questions of genre and how we think about genre and what it is that makes us think something is within a certain genre. And the fact that I didn't realize that this was more of a romance-related book when I was reading it totally affected how I was ingesting it. And then when I did realize, it really negatively affected the way I thought about the rest of the book, even though I wouldn't have had a problem with that had I realized that going in. And so, I don't know, I just think when it comes to genre, that can be a real challenge. A big part of a genre is simply our expectations, and then what happens when our expectations aren't met, or it just has a completely different outcome than we expected.
All I heard is that you hate female authors, but
I know, I know that's how that came out. It's like, that's not like some of my favorite authors are female, but I have no good way of like explaining that doesn't acknowledge that I needed to be prepared, and knowing it was a female from the beginning, yes, would have affected the way I engaged with the book. And I don't know a better way to tell that.
Having said that, sometimes you can be surprised. I remember I was going through two books at a time, and one book I thought was written by a male, and one I thought was written by a female, and they were actually the inverse. And I was
Really?
like, surprised on both of those. I was like, huh, interesting. Anyway, so
I mean, by and large, it doesn't generally matter. I don't feel like Harry Potter, and it's written by a female, but that doesn't seem obvious to us in the way it's written in any way. And like I said, the beginning of this book, it didn't seem obvious, but then as it became obvious, yet I wasn't aware of it, I think that conflict is what suddenly made it harder for me to enjoy it. I was like, oh, I guess if I just like understood that expectation, then maybe I would have enjoyed this book more. And then sure enough, I looked her up and I realized, oh, she writes all about romance. Like even if it doesn't have a happy ending, all of her books are apparently about romance in one way or another. It's like, knowing that would have really affected the way I began this book, and it would have really affected my expectations in a different way. And so, I mean, I think that's part of it. It's like I have to acknowledge what my expectations had been, but at the same time, I also have to acknowledge that this new information did completely change how I was interpreting what I was reading.
I will point out the one thing we thought about J.K. Rowling trying to write teenage boys and their thoughts on romance, and not noticing girls until he's like 15, and talking about the green monster inside him or whatever. So aside from that, you're right. There's nothing.
Is it book 5 that we thought was just like those elements were the worst? We're like, oh, this is not well written. J.K. Rowling, we love you, but you do not understand a 15-year-old boy.
I don't know. The sixth one was where there's a lot of romance and things, and I think that's when he starts noticing Ginny and stuff. And yeah. Anyway,
and no boy is ever surprised that someone is suddenly attractive. Like that's not a thing.
Chances are he's probably already spent time like looking at all the girls. Like, okay, she's got a chance. Anyway, having said that, the books do it way better than the movie does. The moment with Harry and Ginny from the movie is atrocious. So I want to go back real quick to a point though. To
did we get sidetracked?
We went down tangents upon tangents, which is typical for us. So,
which was not reflected in our first video, but
not at all. So going back to, I still feel like this book does feel like a romance. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's not like the central theme, but it is woven into the story on levels more than just, hey, there's characters and this is part of their growth, or they happen to fall in love and that's something that happens in this greater story. It does feel like a central theme to me of this story. And so far, one of the greatest things driving the characters and their actions more than most of the other things. And maybe it just goes back to us not truly understanding, but I'm guessing the rest of their character just hadn't been fully fleshed out, or their motivations at this point from a very young author. But those things are clearly in there in terms of, that those love interests. So I do think that it is a central theme to this book. And here, this is a little bit different, but still I feel like it's in there. She has wording in these books that I think are meant to make it a little bit more charged than is necessary. So like this is after one of the, I can't even remember. I think it's Celaena and Dorian go back to the room after they'd had the fight or whatever, and they're like trying to debrief and like, magic, whatever, and figure things out. And it's talking about him, and she says he stripped naked. Again, like not like he was changing his clothes, whatever. Stripped, but stripped naked. And then just following after that is she caught a gleam of golden skin and then turned away, And so it's like, it gives you that sense of she's there. She can kind of glimpse this naked body of this handsome man and his golden skin. So there's
Golden skin. Such awkward phrasing.
There's wording like that in there that I feel like is deliberately put in these scenes where, like, there's really should be no like sexual charge at all in terms of they were almost killed, they're figuring this out, whatever, and yet it's dropped in there lastly, like in the middle of that fight with Archer near the end. And this one just got me completely, but she says Dorian, as he's thinking, like, because he doesn't know Archer right at this point, and there's this guy coming in scuffling all this stuff, and Dorian refers to, as he sees Archer grab the book and run away, he says, that handsome man, grabbed the book and ran away. Like, that's what Dorian thinks in the middle of this fight, is like, that handsome man. So again, maybe a woman would have, and this is coming from, would have had that thought, but as much as I can acknowledge, a handsome man as much as anyone, I don't think that would have been my first thought in the middle of a fight and a scuffle, and when they're running away with something that I desperately need to get back. Would have been like, how do I describe this guy? He's just handsome. There's just things like that are throughout the books that I think are meant to create a little bit of, like, even if subtly, kind of remind us of, oh, these attractive people, or make us feel those things. And so I would argue, I do definitely think that this falls within the romantasy genre. I think that, obviously the genre's come a long way. This was early on, and I can't remember if I said this in the last video or not. I definitely made note of it, but I'm not saying that Sarah J. Maas is the inventor of the romantasy genre, but she's definitely strongly influenced it throughout through her books, and had a huge say on what it is. And there's a lot of people that are now emulating her in her books. And so she has done that. And so a lot of times when we see those tropes, it's like, yeah, they're tropes because they're things that she kind of helped popularize through these books. And so I don't know, it is there. I think like I said, these are early on. This is when the genre was still kind of new. So maybe it doesn't look the same way as what we think of as romantasy now. But for me, I definitely think it is. But that was just a way for me to monologue and get my points out while my wife isn't here, so that I can make my case and feel like I won that argument. But I don't know. I really am curious to know what other people think, especially people who are fans of these books, if they agree, if that's how they look at the series or not.
I didn't realize that was a debate. I mean, like you said, and from what I've heard, is that the first few books are not nearly as popular as the later books, especially in terms of judgment on the quality of them. But the idea of not even counting them within the genre of romantasy, that surprises me. I'm not an expert on romantasy. I have read probably more than my fair share of romantasy books, I struggle with them. I want to enjoy them. I've said this before. When it comes to tropes and stuff, I will just kind of roll my eyes. It's like, whatever, I'm not the intended audience. I can get over that. It's when I feel like there's blatantly bad writing that I will be more judgmental of a series or a book. And in this one, I think my favorite thing was the fact that we clearly saw some improvement from the first book to the second book. I don't think that we're all the way there. I still think that I have some of my major underlying issues in terms of, well, we knew it was going to be a love triangle, and I just felt like the motivation was poorly written for creating that rift between the two, and the fact that her as an assassin still just makes zero sense. I still have that issue. It wasn't fully resolved, but I do think she went a long ways in trying to resolve it in terms of giving some backstory, talking about her training like at least once, talking about her time in the mines. Those types of things I think went a long way. And I didn't come away with nearly as many like just awkward sentences that I hated in the first book. I was like, oh, I didn't care for that. And I think that was a really valuable element of a sense of progress. And so I'm excited to see what happens in this third book. And I'm especially excited because so the first book ends with, well, now she's the King's Champion. And there was this sense of like, oh, what's going to happen in the next book? She's going to be off in the world as his assassin. But that's not how this book played out at all. I feel like the third book has to be that way. I feel like the third book has to introduce more characters, has to make it more complex, has to give us more to work with than just being in the castle. That's my perception. I don't know about yours.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's why I really like that these people that were trying to thwart the king, Archer and his group, they ended up being just another evil, they weren't good. They had the same goal as what Celaena wants to see, like enemies of the king, but then not, but they're also not good guys. And so that's now creating another level and another group and some more perspectives and things that you have to weigh, I think. And my last thing is, as you just mentioned, just that Sergei Maas, I will say it's not always, because I read the first 3 ACOTAR, which she wrote later. I will say I know her as an author. She's a much better writer than what we're seeing in these books. She's obviously come a long way. Now, that's not always my preference, but there's things that there are things that maybe are my opinion, like things I don't prefer as much, but in terms of just ability to write, she's certainly a very gifted writer, and we see it getting there in these early books. Like you said, we've already seen that progression, so that does set up hope that, okay, I know that where she can get to, and so I look forward to seeing the story. As you said, it's opening up now, and I think that if it takes the same kind of steps forward in the next book that we saw from 1 to 2, I think that's really shows that the series is progressing towards what everybody says it is.
Yeah, and I think that would be significant progress. I mean, I think if we could take, again, about the same level of progress in terms of quality of writing, I think I will enjoy this third book significantly more. And, it's a long enough series that means by the end, I think there's a chance for me to really appreciate the quality of writing on top of things that I do like. I mean, I enjoy the world that she has presented. I just need a little more definition in some cases. And I do think the biggest thing, looking forward, I think that the writing has improved. I'd like to see it continue improving. But I do think the biggest thing looking forward is getting better motivation and better compatibility between what we know about Celaena and then what's actually being presented about Celaena. I think that is the biggest issue that I'm hoping can somehow, I'm not entirely sure how, but somehow be resolved in each of these books, at least a little more to help us understand her moral compass or the lack thereof, or the incredibly complicated moral compass that she has. Whatever it is that is providing her this motivation that just doesn't seem to make sense to us at this time. That's my thought.
I look forward to it. I look forward to seeing how she navigates that.
Yeah, me too. Well, Trevor, I think that that is enough on this book, especially since there's more in the series that I look forward to us getting to. Any other thoughts? Anything else that you wanted to add about this book in particular, or I don't know what you're looking forward to in the next book?
Oh, I got it all out of my system. No, I'm just really excited to see where she goes with it and how, in what direction, because to me, I think there's a lot of different ways and a lot that she can start introducing. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for joining me, Trevor, on our second attempt at this Bromantasy series. This won't come out today, but for everyone out there that's curious, we are recording on Valentine's Day, just to go with the theme of Bromantasy. But I look forward to talking about the third book, and of course, as always, please, if you have any thoughts, anything else you would like to add to the conversation, put it in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.